Welcome and thank you for taking the time to attend the session on the third grade guarantee. As you, I sure have heard this morning, the third grade guarantee is a high priority on our state superintendent's list to ensure that all of our students are equipped with the literacy skills necessary to be successful. We truly see a strong measurement marker is their ability to be able to read by the end of grade 3, and that is the focus. But for that to occur, we want to make sure that measures are put in place so that we can provide early identification and intervention and support to move our students along, to accelerate their reading growth, and to provide them opportunities where they can access and comprehend multiple text. Today, the session is going to cover such areas as the legislation. We know that Substitution Senate Bill 21 was complete in the summer of 2013, but we haven't had an opportunity to have a full venue to really go over that with you, so we wanted to use this during this period. In addition, we'll talk about data reporting and then the resources and tools that we have and that will be coming to help support you along your way of advancing our students in their reading readiness. So just to reinforce, our educational system is about ensuring that upon graduation, our students are ready for post-secondary opportunities, whether we are talking about the world of work, college, or the military. The intent is that our students are able to make a choice. And for that to occur, we want to create milestones along the way to determine our students' progress. And this is one of the key milestones that we have, because a student's ability to demonstrate literacy and the able to read by grade 3 will also allow them to not only access information within English language arts, but it will allow them to access information in science, social studies, mathematics, other disciplines, and the real world. So we have Senate Bill 21. What do we know about Senate Bill 21? We do know and are aware that over the last year, legislation has gone through a number of changes in this arena called the third grade guarantee. Some things have remained the same, and some things have made modifications or have modifications and changes. One of the first that has remained the same is in regards to the reading diagnostic. So that it is understood, by September 30th of each year, all students K through 3 were to be administered a reading diagnostic. The reading diagnostic that is to be administered was to determine whether or not the student was on track or not on track based on end of year previous grade expectations. The assessment that the students could receive could be from one of the two options. Either A, districts could elect to administer the diagnostic that was developed by the state, or you could administer a diagnostic from our approved list of comparable diagnostic tools. The diagnostics that we have from the state that are posted right now were ones that are revised, and they were revised in such a way that the screening measures for each grade are now aligned to previous end of grade level expectations. The other component, if you recall, prior to this year, we did not have reading and math diagnostics, but we now do. So it is expected that once you have administered the diagnostic, you're able to determine whether that student is on track or not on track. Now let me also try to dispel some myths as we're explaining information. The first, legislation does not say that districts are required to administer a pre and post test. Legislation does not limit educators from implementing and administering other diagnostics throughout the year. We understand that is going to occur because you want to monitor the progress of your students. But what legislation did require is that students are administered a diagnostic by September 30th of each year. Another component that we have heard and that people were wondering about is in terms of the administration. Which administration actually counts? And we called it kind of like the first or the benchmark administration. When you administer the assessment to all your students as the benchmark, that's the one that you should use. You're not able to say, okay, I'm going to administer this here, and then the student didn't perform well a couple weeks later, I'll re-administer it, and then if they perform well, all of that fell between September 30th, so they're fine. No, it's the administration, the benchmark administration, when you administered it to all students. You may be getting your students ready and having them engage in other assessments prior to that time period, and that's fine. But once you administer this assessment for that established benchmark, then that's the data that you would use. The other component that we have is when it comes to the diagnostics, you already know you are able to use the one from the comparable tools list. It's not based on school improvements or anything like AYP like it was previously for the reading diagnostic. You can choose between the two, but if you do choose a tool from the comparable tools list, it is at cost to the districts. Now, what happens after after you've administered the diagnostics? This is also a piece of legislation that has remained unchanged, and that is you are to create an individual reading improvement and monitoring plan for all students who are identified as not on track based on the diagnostics. The reading improvement and monitoring plan template is to be completed within 60 days of this identification. Now, legislation did not require that the state create a reading improvement and monitoring plan template, but we did so that we could support our districts as best as we could. So currently on the ODE website, there is a reading improvement and monitoring plan template. And if you recall, within the plan, you're not required to use our template, but it's there for you as a guide, and it also was designed in a Word format so that you could manipulate it to meet your needs at your district level. The things that are to be included in there are such things as the established reading difficulty that has been identified, how you plan to monitor, reading programs that you plan to use. You are encouraged to make sure that you're keeping the parents involved in the process and that you're able to evaluate where the student is. We also incorporated an additional component around teaching that I'll talk to you about in a few minutes, but also to establish so that you can state what teachers are providing the high quality intervention and support needed for the students so that you could accelerate their reading growth. One thing to note about your reading improvement and monitoring plan is this. People have asked, well, what if a student during the year actually demonstrates that they're on track? Can we now take them off a reading improvement and monitoring plan? The intent and expectation is that the student stays on the reading improvement and monitoring plan the entire year until the next school year, and then once, for example, if they were a grade 1 student and then they were identified as not on track, they have a plan, and then they are staying on that plan until the next year, and then as a second grader coming in, they take a diagnostic, and if they demonstrate that they are on track, then you can take them off the plan. But remember, this reading improvement and monitoring plan can grow with the child. It can be fluid in nature. So although they're on the plan for an entire year, you should be monitoring their progress and making adjustments as necessary, which can be documented within the plan. The only other way that a student could possibly also be taking off the plan is if, for example, the student is a third grade student and on an assessment, for example, on the fall OAA that was just administered, that student has demonstrated they are at a proficient level or above on that fall OAA. If they demonstrate that, then you can take that student off the plan at that time. The next one is around retainment. We've had many and a number of questions as it relates to the retainment of students based on their performance on the reading achievement assessment. We kind of categorize it in two different ways. Last year, it was an option. This year, it's a requirement with exemptions. And what do we mean? This year, our third graders on either the fall or the spring administration are to earn a 392 cut score or higher in order not to be retained in the third grade. If a student does earn a 392 or higher, they could possibly be exempted if, in fact, they are identified as an English language learner with 3 or less years of English language acquisition instruction or 3 or less years in U.S. schools. If the student is a student with a significant cognitive disability and has written on their IEP that they're to be exempt. A student could also be exempt if by chance they have been retained at least once in a previous grade at grades K through 2 and received at least 2 years of intensive remediation. And then there's kind of like an all-encompassing one. They may have an identified reading difficulty, they have an IEP, they've been retained. Those are some of the pieces. The last component is in relation to an alternative assessment. And within the legislation, it says that a student demonstrates a level of achievement appropriate determined by the department based on an alternative assessment, not the alternate assessment for students with significant cognitive disabilities, but an alternative assessment. That alternative assessment will be identified by the department. We are going through a process right now, and we expect to have information on the alternative assessment by early spring of 2014. If a student takes that alternative assessment, it can be administered anytime throughout the year. It's just that you cannot make the decision about a student's retainment until using the alternative assessment until after the student has taken that OAA assessment. Now, when we think about retainment, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but just keep in mind, the student will have, in this process, an opportunity to take a fall administration of the OAA. They will have an opportunity to take a spring administration of the OAA. If they are not successful on either one or do not achieve a 392, then they could exercise the option of engaging in summer remediation and then taking an assessment, which we're looking at trying to have a what we kind of call OAA rebranded, a summer version of the OAA. And then if they're still not successful, then a student could potentially be promoted based on the mid-year promotion policy that all districts have to create and implement. So those are the ways that a student can demonstrate their proficiency and their support. Within the new legislation, so some of the things that have changed. We talked about the Reading Improvement and Monitoring Plan, we talked about retainment, we also talked about the diagnostic, but there were some things that were new. And they fall into these three big buckets: reading competencies, teacher qualifications, and staffing plans. So when it comes to the reading competencies, they are currently being under the revision phase. So they are in development, they are being reviewed and receiving feedback from representatives from early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. The expectation within the legislation is that by January 31st, 2014, that we would have reading competencies approved by the State Board of Education. The reading competencies truly communicate what a teacher should know and be able to do. The reading competencies will embrace such information as addressing the 5 essential components to reading development. They will also address a teacher's ability to understand and use differentiation, a teacher's ability to understand and use a variety of high-quality instructional tools, their ability to understand and use varied assessments to see where their students are in terms of monitoring their progress, and then to be able to select appropriate materials that will help advance their students' learning. Once the reading competencies are created and adopted in January, then what will occur is that the department will take the existing approved list of credentials and training programs and reevaluate that to determine if those programs and credentials now match the reading competencies. And if they don't, they will no longer be on the list, but if they do, they will remain. We will then also open up the list so that we could offer an opportunity for other vendors or entities to apply based on these qualifications as well. Teacher qualifications. This has been a never-ending change in terms of efforts as the legislation has moved forth. We've seen a number of changes, but now it has been solidified. And I can tell you from our experience, we used to receive a number of calls about teacher qualifications. We haven't received as many as since this legislation has been passed. But let me walk you through the different options that are being made available. One, more flexibility has truly been afforded in the new legislation. We went from very strict and limited options to increased flexibility in terms of ensuring that teachers with high quality skills in the area of reading are working with our students who are most at risk or require high levels of intervention in the area of reading. So what's the first thing? If you recall, before the teacher qualifications only applied to K-3 teachers. Now they only apply to teachers of third grade students. So these qualifications are not to be held to the K-2 teachers. It doesn't mean that we don't want our K-2 teachers to meet these expectations. We do, and we still strongly encourage you to ensure that your most high qualified teachers are working with our students who are not on track. But at the same time, we want to adhere to the legislation, which now states that this requirement around teacher qualifications is only applicable to teachers of third grade students, and more specifically and more narrowed to teachers of third grade students that are either not on track or have been retained. So it's not the whole third grade population, it is more so for that population, the population of students that are identified as not on track or have been retained. What is another component? Another component to the teacher qualifications is that they have to have at least 1 year teaching experience. Previously, it was at least 3 years and directly tied to reading. Now it's at least 1 year teaching experience that the teachers have to have. And that is the initial screener. So first it's third grade, and then once you are identified as a third grade teacher, then have you met the qualifications? Check 1, you have at least 1 year teaching experience. From there, you have to demonstrate your qualifications by showing you have met one of the multiple options that are now being afforded. The K-12 reading endorsement is still available. The P3 notation on a teacher's license is not. That has not been the case. That's not a reading endorsement. It does acknowledge coursework that's been taken, but the K-12 reading endorsement is actually a different and separate program. So if a teacher, if a educator has a reading endorsement and at least 1 year teaching experience, they can work with students who are identified as not on track or are identified as being retained in the third grade. What about the master's in reading? The master's in reading is acceptable. A master's in literacy is acceptable. A PhD in literacy and a PhD in reading. All of those will qualify the teacher. The other one that we have is the rated above value added. I know this one, the one that's closest to your heart for all reasons and purposes. Please understand it's an option. It is one of multiple options that can be exercised, but it's rated above value added for the previous consecutive 2 years. And then the next one that we have is that the teacher has been rated most effective based on their teacher rating on the approved list of assessments for the student growth measures for 2 consecutive years. If you choose not to exercise those options, then you could exercise a 5th option, which is taking the rigorous test of reading instruction. The test is approximately $130, and it is an ETS test, and it is number 5203, Teaching Elementary Reading. And I'm kind of modifying the name, but basically Teaching Elementary Reading. That is the test that can be taken. You can go online and access the link on our site so that you can access the site to receive the information. And you're able to sign up and take it in different places across the state. What is the question? Once a teacher takes this test, is there an expiration date? Do they have to retake it next year? Do they have to take it for 2 years? There isn't an expiration date attached to it, so once you've taken it and passed it, you have met the qualifications. The state is not incurring the cost. The cost is incurred at the local level. What is another option? And we made sure we wanted to specifically say this has no expiration date. Credentials for diverse learners. For those teachers who work with students who are identified as English language learners or students with significant cognitive disabilities, they can meet the qualifications by having earned a credential or completing a training from the approved ODE list. We placed no expiration date on here because that's not applicable for all educators. This is only applicable for those teachers who are working with ELL students with less than 3 years in U.S. schools or less than 3 years with English language acquisition instruction, or those that are working with students with significant cognitive disabilities. No expiration means this is afforded to those teachers ongoing. They won't have to worry about meeting another option. What also has happened within the legislation, they have indicated that they wanted to kind of look and be forward thinking. We do have teachers already in our profession, but what about the teachers that are coming in? We need to make sure they're prepared from the onset. So the intent is that the pre-K3 license on and after July 1st, 2017 will ensure that the teachers have met the qualifications. So any educator that completes their teacher preparation program and earns a pre-K through 3 license on or after July 1st, 2017 will not have to meet any other requirements. Their license will do just that. Now we have some pathways to teacher qualifications. Some of the pathways that we have are around the credentialing. Now, if you recall, in the previous slide, I indicated that teachers of students who are identified as ELL and teachers of students with significant cognitive disabilities, they can use this credential and training option forever. There isn't an expiration date. But for those teachers who do not have a reading endorsement or a master's or have met value added or the effective teacher or chose not to take the test, they can still work with third grade students that are identified as not on track or are retained as long as they have completed a credential or earned a credential or completed a training from our approved list. But they can only do so until 2016. So there's an expiration date on this credentials and training list for those teachers outside of the diverse populations that I mentioned earlier. Another pathway, though, is if you're in a building and you find that you have more students than teachers who might be qualified, there are some other ways to ensure that you have qualified teachers working with students. Earlier, I mentioned that a teacher had to have at least 1 year teaching experience. But what if a district hires teachers and they've hired a teacher that this is their first year? They don't have 1 year teaching experience under their belt. But that teacher actually holds a master's in reading or literacy or even a PhD, or that teacher holds a reading endorsement. If that teacher has less than 1 year teaching experience, but they hold a reading endorsement or they hold a master's in reading, or they have taken the test and passed it, they can serve as the assigned teacher or teacher of record as long as they are also mentored by a staff member that meets all of the qualifications. So let me say that again. A teacher that actually does not have 1 year teaching experience but has either shown that they passed the test, they have a reading endorsement or a master's in reading or literacy or a PhD in reading or literacy, they can actually serve and fulfill the requirement as long as they are also mentored by a staff member that meets the qualifications. But what if you are even at another level where you have educators that do not meet the qualifications at all, but you have a large number of students who are identified as not on track? What can happen is you could have what I kind of would call an intervention specialist. The intervention specialist would have to be a licensed teacher, but you could have an intervention specialist that meets the qualifications. So you have one that either has a master's in reading or has taken a test or reading endorsement. If they have met the qualifications for teachers, they can serve as that student's reading teacher and provide the reading instruction and intervention and support to that student. What has to happen, though, is that student's actual teacher of record and the principal have to agree that this other teacher is going to provide them that support. And then that information has to be documented on their reading improvement and monitoring plan. If you've accessed our reading improvement and monitoring plan template that we have on our ODE website, you will see that we have a section devoted to that already, so you can incorporate that information. So that means the teacher who does not meet the qualifications would still be the teacher of record, but you have determined that the student is going to receive this intervention and instruction and support from another teacher. But let's say, for example, you exercised all the options. The at least 1 year reading endorsement, master's, value added, most effective teacher, the reading test. You've also utilized some of the pathways to qualifications that I shared with you. And yet, you still do not have a sufficient number of teachers to work with your students. Then districts were able to submit a staffing plan. We received over 400 staffing plans from districts and schools. The intent is that you would submit a staffing plan to the department. But if you submit a staffing plan to the department, the expectation is that although you don't have to receive, quote, approval from the department, you would have to post your staffing plan on your district's website or community school's website. And then you also will have to submit to the department a progress report in terms of where you are ensuring that you have the sufficient number of teachers to work with your students who are identified as not on track or retained at the 3rd grade level. This monitoring, this mid-year report that you would give us, or progress report, is actually expected to be due by March 30th of 2014. To help support along the way, in early spring, around January, we are looking at releasing an actual template that districts can use, so you won't have to worry about creating one on your own. We're looking at creating a template. It's not required by legislation, but we wanted to provide some assistance. So we're looking at creating a template that can be provided. What has also been afforded to districts is if, in fact, you get too close to the end of the year and you assess and say, well, we've made great strides, but we are still not where we wanted to be, then those that submitted staffing plans can also request an extension from the department to their staffing plan. And extensions can be provided and granted until the end of the 2015-2016 school year. So you can't necessarily ask for an extension in the spring of 2016, but you can ask for extensions up to the spring of 2015. Those districts that would be requesting an extension would have to submit that information to the department by April 30th, 2014, and thereafter. We will also provide a template that districts will complete for requesting an extension. What is the expectation? The intent and primary goal is to ensure that when we think about our students who are most at risk and are at need, that they are demonstrating, or that districts are demonstrating, they are pairing them up with teachers who are most qualified so that we can provide the necessary support needed. Now, when we think about retention, we also wanted to bring to attention some of these pieces. The parent refusal. We have information in there when we talk about parent refusals. In relation to the 3rd grade guarantee, if a parent says, I don't want my child to take a diagnostic, by all rights, that can occur. If a parent states, well, you assess my student and it's been determined that they're not on track, but I don't want my child to have a reading improvement and monitoring plan, that is their right, they can do that. If a parent says, I don't want my child to take the OAA because it's a state level assessment, they could choose to do that. But please understand that a student has to demonstrate that they have achieved a 392 or higher on the OAA to be promoted. If a student does not take the OAA, whether they choose not to take it or they just don't perform well, they do not have that score of a 392 and they will be retained. A parent cannot refuse the retainment. If they have not demonstrated that they have met the requirements to be promoted to the 4th grade, the parent cannot say, well, that's fine, I respect your decision, but they're going to move on. They are not able to refuse the retention, but they could refuse other areas as it relates to that. The OAAs and the retention piece. I talked earlier about some of the options that are going to be afforded. What I can also tell you is we had some questions because it was stated. This year, we have the fall version of the OAA, and then in the spring, we will also have another administration. But when we transition to our next generation assessments in 14-15, will we still have a fall administration? And what I can tell you is we are still, because we understand it's a kind of high stakes assessment, that we are still looking at providing multiple opportunities for students to take the assessment. It has not been determined if a fall administration will still be afforded, but there will be multiple opportunities for the student to be able to take the assessment. At this time, at least through the Park Consortia, the assessment would not be ready in time for the fall administration as when we currently have a testing window. But we are looking at other alternatives to offer multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate their proficiency before advancing to the 4th grade. The other component that we have is around the district promotion policy. Legislation does require that this year that the districts do have a district promotion policy in place, which describes what you plan to do to create an opportunity for students to demonstrate that they are ready and reading on track to be promoted to the 4th grade. Now, the state was not required to create a policy because this is what was required of the district level. And we look to provide some guidance in the information that we have on our ODE website, and we'll look to provide some additional guidance in the future. But let me go back to the process for a student as they're moving forth to demonstrate their ability to read at grade level. Right now, this year's 3rd graders, where the retention is a requirement, have a fall opportunity to take the test. They then have a spring opportunity to take the test. They could have also taken an alternative assessment, which is at the cost of the districts. It's not at the cost of the state, but they could also have taken an alternative assessment and demonstrated level of achievement such to be promoted. If they were not successful there and they did not fall underneath exemptions, then based on legislation, they can also engage in summer remediation. And they would have summer remediation, and then they would be able to demonstrate that they have mastered their expectations of the standards and are reading at grade level by taking a test. We are looking to make available the a summer version of the OAA. If they take that test and they still prove that they are not successful, then you would take on your mid-year promotion policy, and that's what your district policy is, your mid-year promotion policy. They could still be promoted. Even though they were retained going into the next school year, they still have an opportunity to be promoted mid-year to the 4th grade. What we want you to keep in mind are some things. The first thing, when you're considering promoting your student, you don't want to look at a situation and say, this student could potentially be promoted in December of 2014, but you're promoting this student based on the fact that they're reading at the end of 3rd grade level. They're still not on track. We are saying when you're promoting your students, they should be reading on grade level based on the time that they are being promoted, so that you're putting your students in a great position for success. Legislation also states that if you retain a student, but if that student demonstrates that they are achieving at appropriate levels in other areas like math, science, social studies, that they could receive instruction appropriate to that level. That legislation doesn't specifically say that the students should automatically go to 4th grade. That legislation states that if a student is retained in 3rd grade, but they are demonstrating that they are achieving higher than 3rd grade level in the other content areas, then they should receive instruction appropriate to that. So that's the flexibility that the districts have, where you're not necessarily saying you have a child in 3rd grade and then in 4th grade in other areas, they're receiving 4th grade instruction. If by chance you have a student that you believe is going to fulfill your mid-year promotion policy requirements, and you believe there's a strong likelihood that this child will be promoted to the 4th grade sometime during that 2nd retainment year, we are strongly advising you that you expose that student to 4th grade instruction in other areas prior to being promoted. Because you could promote this child in reading, but if they're not exposed to appropriate content in math, science, or social studies, you've now put them behind. So you want to make sure that you're setting the student up for success. Those are some of the pieces of guidance that are included in our guidance document, but that we wanted to share with you. Because this and that the promotion policy, districts get to determine what assessments what assessment or evaluation you're using to determine whether a student is ready to be promoted to the 4th grade. You're not required to use an OAA. We don't have an OAA that would be appropriate that you could even use for the mid-year promotion, particularly if you're thinking about a student being promoted mid-year in December. Because our OAA for 3rd grade is based on end of 3rd grade expectations, and our 4th grade OAA is based on end of year 4th grade expectations, and we only are administering the 4th grade one time a year. So districts get to determine what assessments that you're going to use. You just have to make sure that it's aligned to our expectation, is meeting that level of rigor. When it comes to data and reporting, last year you had year-end EMIS data. And so this is the continued practice. This year, you are expected to administer the diagnostics by September 30th. The October reporting for EMIS, districts can report during that time period. It is understood that with the writing and the mathematics diagnostics, you are not held to the September 30th requirement. You can administer those anytime during the school year. So since you can administer the writing and the mathematics diagnostic anytime during the school year, those can be reported through year-end EMIS data. The other component that we have on here is in relation to the staffing plan. So as we stated with the staffing plan, you will report to us your progress through a mid-year report, those that submitted staffing plans, by March 30th. And then if you want to request an extension, you can do that. But what we are doing as a department, although we were not required to give every single person an approval, it doesn't mean that we just are sitting your plans by the wayside. We are reviewing your plans, and then we also will have to review your progress reports, because we will then have to take all of that information and create a report based on that will be given to the State Board, the General Assembly, and the Governor's Office. And then we also have our K-3 literacy progress measure. And the K-3 literacy progress measure, which will appear on the report card, will be based on the reduction in the percentage of students who are identified as not on track based on the OAA and are identified as not proficient based on the 3rd grade reading assessment. Please understand where I went with the 3rd grade piece. It is not the cut score. It's the proficient score. There's a difference. Information about the K-3 literacy progress measure is accessible on our ODE website. Documentation and information around it has been provided. Please be cognizant of the fact that they're not only looking at the progress and the reduction, but there are certain areas that are going to look closely at students who were never identified as not on track, but then now get to the 3rd grade test and they're not proficient. That won't work in a district's favor. Or students who were identified as not on track, then on track, and then all of a sudden they get to the OAA and they're not proficient. We want to create sustainability. So that information has been put in place. The other requirement, or the other things that we have, are resources and supports. We have a video on our website on the 3rd grade guarantee, and it is still truly amazing to me how, with all the changes in the legislation, this video is still very relevant. It is something that you can show parents, it's something that you can show the community, and even though we've gone through changes and this was developed in the fall of last year, this video still is relevant in communicating accurate information. The next piece is, you can mark your calendars. I've officially identified a date. December 5th. December 5th, December 5th. The plan is December 5th, we will host a live 3rd grade reading guarantee webinar. So not one that you just have to listen and I give you information, but one where you get to ask questions and send us to that. My intent and expectation and goal has always been, once the legislation would remain more static, that we would have webinars and to try to look at our schedules. So we will have one in the fall, one in the spring. So we've identified the date right now as December 5th. So you can mark that on your calendar. If you also noticed in our redesign on our website, we have a plethora of resources. We've identified them in different ways, but there are many things that you can access on our ODE website to make it more user-friendly. On the left-hand side, it tells you some of the new things that have been added, and then we've also identified it as things such as like district resources, teacher resources, and things of that sort. What is also present, we have the high-level legislative update that we provided in early fall. We also included our reading improvement and monitoring plan template, and then we also have our third grade guidance manual that has been posted on our site, which provides great detail. I can tell you that some things that have confused people before, we heard people say, I can't believe that you're almost giving us a 40-page guidance document last year. And then it had red in it, so some of it was black, some of it was red color, and so the red was supposed to be the new. And they said, this is just too much for us. So we said, well, what we're going to do now that it's final is to take that guidance document, we're going to revamp it. We won't have any red in it because now it has been reviewed. We've taken out things that are not relevant anymore, and this is the new guidance document. So everything is in black, but everything in black is also the things that were either existing or new to the table. So this is a brand new guidance document. If you have any questions, you can feel free to contact us, but we try to give you information on every single aspect or intricacy within the legislation itself. Those are the big pieces. So now what I'm going to do for the last few minutes is if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them at this time. Now, I'm going to tell you, you truly are going to have to use your teacher voice because we have all three parts of the ballroom. I don't know what they did with the other ones, but I believe in ballroom 3, they were able to have a microphone that was right there. So you could either use the microphone. Oh, but then we have our lovely Mr. Hosier, who has there's a microphone right there. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on. So there is a microphone in ballroom 1 and ballroom 3. Questions? Yes.
Gave the assessment by September 30th, student on track. Fall, and obviously this is only going to occur this year because we definitely have the fall OAAs. But so the student, we get the results back and they're below 392, but we're on track based on ODE screener. Can we put the student on a RIMP just to be safe? I mean, student didn't have a sit-down meeting with a parent, didn't get the official RIMP, but they are now in danger of failing. Is that something an LEA decision can be made?
Yes, at the local level, you can decide to do that. What I would say and what I would do is to be very careful to say, 1, look at all the data that you have on the student, and 2, also remember that the third grade reading assessment is based on end of year expectations. So if a student is not necessarily proficient in the fall, that's not a bad thing. So if they show that they were on track based on the diagnostic that was administered September 30th and they're in the third grade, and then all of a sudden they take the fall OAA and you get the results back and they did not reach the proficient level, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be on a reading improvement and monitoring plan. I will tell you that there have been cases where people have found they have some students who might have been just made it on the diagnostic, and then they took the third grade OAA and may have been in a low level of limited status. In that particular case, you may want to think about that, but that's truly a local level decision. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. What I can tell you is that for
that question. Can we ask the question again?
Yes. So what I'll try and do is, for those who don't have a microphone, I'll repeat. The question on the table was, and I'm going to try to summarize, what should we do with our students who are on IEP? How should they be handled? And what we have been stating is, if you look at our guidance document, within our guidance document, we give 2 pieces of criteria. We give criteria and look at it through 2 different lenses, and I believe it's on approximately page 14. And what we are stating is, since this is a local level decision, to really look at that in comparison to what you know, and to talk with your IEP team and make that decision about that student. Because what I want to reinforce is, there is an opportunity for exemption, but what you want to be very cognizant of with all your students, but particularly students with disabilities, is that you are not also crossing the line of restricting access, because we also want to make sure we have access as well. Yes.
Okay.
And then the gentleman in the blue.
Okay, for teachers who are credentialed by one of the research-based programs, once you have the competencies in place, if one of those programs was to come off of the list, would those teachers still be credentialed?
That's a very good question, and what we're looking at is to kind of see where there's going to be a phase, where there would be a phasing out process, because the reality is that alignment work and release has to be done by July 1st. So once we do that in July, we won't put districts in a situation where you automatically have to look at a backup. What I would, though, do is to really look at that option, particularly for those teachers who are not working with students who are ELL or those students with a disability, to understand that this is a bridge. So whatever is happening, you should recognize this will never be long-standing anyway. But that's a good question. Yes, sir.
So part of the accountability piece is getting the measure and then obviously a grade. There's a 5% cap that they talk about with the third grade reading guarantee. Is that for kindergarten? How does that process work for the 5% cap?
Okay, and so when we're talking about the K-3 literacy progress measure, and I believe you're talking about the less than 5% cap that says that they're not held accountable for, you don't have to worry about it if you have kids that are above, basically. And if I recall, it is for grade K. They're fine, that language should be on the site, but I believe it's just for grade K, and it's the 5% cap. What you did mention is, and where this is really going to the next piece is, the K-3 literacy measure is one thing. But starting in, if I recall, 2016, if a district earns a D or an F on the report card for the K-3 literacy progress measure, and they have less than 60% of their students not proficient on the third grade OAA, and all of this for 2 consecutive years, then that district will have to submit what's called a district academic achievement plan. And they'll basically have to talk about how they're going to change those situations. And that's where this plays a role.
If for this year, we have less than 5% of our kindergartners that are on track, will we get a measure at all this year? Or will we get a grade next year if we have, say, 2 years of less than 5% of our students?
I'll have to go back and look at that and give you that information. If I recall, the way that the K-3 progress measure, should go is that you would get a grade of above, but you wouldn't. I mean, you'd get higher than a C. But I'll get that to confirm it to you about the less than 5%.
And you've hinted that it's not a regular administration. So is the summer administration a regular third grade OAA test that we order from ODE and is delivered?
Yes, it is. It's the same. Yes, it would be the same. It would be the same level of difficulty, same number of items and everything. Okay. It just would be administered in the summer.
Okay. Can the alternative test that's also available for use during the year, can that also be administered during the summer?
Yeah, you could. You can administer it anytime.
So you could administer both during the summer.
You could administer it anytime.
I'm a little still confused about the exemption for some students with IEPs. I've read in the document that there are some students that can be exempt that are outside of well, explain again whether or not it's just the alternate assessment students that are exempt, or are there other students with IEPs that can be exempt if there are other conditions? You mentioned significant cognitive disability, but I have a child that is going blind, cannot read Braille. He's in third grade, so he can't read the assessments. Am I going to be able, and he's not a significant cognitive disabled child.
There's a difference between the two. And there's one, we have the piece that's called a case-by-case basis. So if we do have a situation where we have a student that has experienced something that is going blind, then that would be an exemption, and that's what would be addressed. Then there's the IEP, and the one related to the IEP is the one that you would use the guidance document on to help support that information. If a student is if we have students with significant cognitive disabilities that are taking the alternate assessment for students with significant cognitive disabilities, they are automatically exempted because they are not even integrated into the standard testing system.
So how do I get the blind kid exempt?
You would it would be a case-by-case basis at the request of the department, so you would send information to the department, and we will provide that process.
Okay.
Is your last name Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
He's doing very well. I asked that question because I received some questions from someone, and then he started asking, and I was thinking, these questions seem word for word from that email that I have. So, hello, Mr. Moore. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I apologize if you've already addressed this and I just missed it, but if a child has gone through all the different options of they have not passed OAA, didn't get a 392, you did all the additional testing or whatever, so that it's time for fourth grade to start, and now the only thing left on the table is mid-year acceleration. I guess my question is two parts. What is mid-year, and what is the determinant as to what allows you to say, okay, you're now a fourth grader? Is that an ODE developed test? Will it be a test that is on a list of accepted assessments? For example, MAP, Measures of Academic Progress, is on third grade reading guarantee list as an approved vendor assessment. Is it going to be a list like that, or is it going to be there's just a specific ODE created test? Again, I apologize if you've already answered that and I missed it.
No, that's okay. That's a good question, and I did, but I'll make it a little clearer because I may have incorporated into a lot of things. The first thing, when you asked about mid-year, by definition within law, the law does not specify the length of time for mid-year. So districts are creating their mid-year promotion policy and they can determine that. Let me give some suggestions to say, when you think about mid-year, you really want to work in the best interest of your students. So when you have a student, if you wait too long to promote them, and especially if you did not give them exposure to other content, please know when you promote a student to the fourth grade, they will be taking now the fourth grade achievement test. So you want to set them up for success. So you get to determine that. Where we're also stating is when you promote a student, you should make sure that you're promoting a student based on the fact that they are not only reading at grade level, but engaging in the other areas at the appropriate level based on the time that you're promoting them. So districts get to decide what mid-year means, and then you also get to decide, but then we're also encouraging you to ensure that they're demonstrating readiness at the time of promotion. The second option, the question that you asked, was in relation to the assessment and what assessment is used to determine that. Because the mid-year promotion policy is a local decision, as I indicated earlier, we give the test in the fall and the spring, and we will offer a test in the summer. But what you use for your mid-year promotion policy, you will determine that. We just gave you guidance on when you're looking for that assessment, what you need to make sure that you keep in mind as the evaluation tool to determine if that student should be promoted. So you get to decide that, we don't. And we aren't going to be creating, quote, a list of acceptable assessments that you would use for mid-year promotion.
Thank you.
Okay, it's sort of a three-part question maybe. My question has to do with SLOs, with the diagnostics, and with the third grade reading guarantee. And it's a little creative, but teachers have asked this question. If you choose to give the end-of-year diagnostic in grades maybe K1 and 2 as your September 30th reading assessment, could you then incorporate that information into your SLO and use it to measure growth? Pros and cons, possible or not?
If you use your end of year, if you use an end of year diagnostic for September 30th, could you use it for SLOs?
Correct, and then how would that affect your K through 3 literacy progress on your report card once it is graded?
What I will say is, in terms of SLOs and those relationships, I really say go to teaching profession. But outside of the SLOs, where I would go most importantly is to say, if the focus is to look at a diagnostic and to think about the diagnostic from the lens of the SLO, that's very dangerous, because if you're going to use an end-of-year diagnostic for September 30th, when by all rights they should be assessed based on the previous end-of-year expectations, you're really not setting the kids up for success. So you almost are getting a false report in respects, because if you have a large number of students who take an end-of-year diagnostic by September 30th and they are not on track, you really don't know where they are, because you are basing it on what they should learn at the end of the year, not at the beginning of the year.
So good advice would be to give, possibly good advice, the screening diagnostic at the beginning of the year, because that's the information most valuable at that point in time. And then how you develop your SLO is up to you.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I thought I had a question right here, this lady. And then I think, and I'm sorry, I'm left-handed, so I should look to the left all the time for you.
On the reading diagnostic that we gave in K through 3 at the beginning of the year, there was a category that was further assessment recommended. Do you know what I'm talking about? But I didn't see much other, I mean, it was just there, but no information what we were supposed to do with that.
On what assessments there are. When we have further assessment recommended, if you also will notice on the reading improvement and monitoring plan template, we not only have a section in the first part that allows you to put your diagnostic data by September 30th, but we also have a section that allows you to incorporate other assessment data that you have used. And so what this is saying is, you administered a diagnostic by September 30th that detected this student was not on track. In order to really look more deeply at what the root reading difficulty is, you would engage in other further assessment. So that's what that is looking at, to say, make a comprehensive determination before you put them on that.
But there was a category on track, but further assessment recommended.
I'll have to go back and look at that one. I'll have to go back and look at that one. Okay. And what you may want to look at is, and I'll go back and look, but if you have a category on track but further assessment recommended, depending on the domains in terms of the assessment, they very well overall would have been on track, but further assessment may be recommended if in fact in one of the areas they just did not show their strength.
Yeah, that was an overall number, and my concern is we don't have very many RIMPs, but yet we last year for our third grade OAA, we did not have great results. So the two figures are contradictory.
And where I would go, what I would also say to you with that is, if you looked at things and only based your information on the administration of the September 30th diagnostic, that is not working in the best interest. What should happen is you should base the September 30th as well as subsequent assessments that you're using to monitor the student's progress to confirm what you know. Now, if you're seeing all of those and the OAA as a disconnect, then you should go back and reevaluate. But if you have only looked at the results from September 30th and then the results that were on the OAA, you'll want to look at that and see, well, what's going on? Because all students most likely may not have scored high. Some of them may have scored high on the on track, and then some of them may have just gotten over on the on track. Yes.
This isn't so much a nuts and bolts question, but I'm talking with parents, and they ask me, why is retention going to help my kid? And I can't find the research that supports retention as helping a child. And I go on ODE website, I don't see anything about where the idea comes from and where I can help teachers and parents of retain kids on why is this a good idea to do it in the first place. Well, I don't know if you can help me with that.
And you know what? I actually did not include it in this slide. I usually had it in some other slides, and I believe it's the Casey Foundation, and there's some research on promotion. But let me create this scenario for you. If you have a student right now who is in third grade and they demonstrated that they're not reading at grade level, and they need to be retained, the two questions you would ask yourself is, I understand the question about retention, but my question would be, how did my child get to this point where they are earning a score to the point where they need to be retained? Because there has to be an issue or a concern from that standpoint. That's one. So we have to ask and then by asking that question, your other question is, if you promote a student to the fourth grade, and academically they're not ready and they're not able to read at grade level, and they're being exposed to more increasingly complex text. If they can't grasp the text prior to, what means that they're going to grasp that text earlier on? And who's to say that that student in 4th grade is still going to receive the high-quality intensive intervention that they need then if they did not get it in K3 prior to? So there's two sides of the coin to it. It's understood about the social emotional aspect of it, but what really should be the question is not, and I see where they're going, but not necessarily why is my student being retained in grade 3? The question should be, why wasn't intervention taking place early on in grades K3 so that this did not happen? That's been the biggest concern, because once they enter 4th grade, they still are demonstrating that they're struggling in an area of reading. What confidence should that parent have that they're going to get the intervention in 4th grade if they didn't get it the last 3 years? And now they're going to be exposed to increasingly complex text. And what we find is that as students are progressing and being exposed to this text, not just in ELA but in other areas, they tend to struggle, they tend to turn off and drop out. So socially they may be, and they may have moved up, but academically they're not making that progress. Huh?
I'm sorry. Don't children who are retained drop out at a higher rate than those that are socially promoted? Research I read says that, but I would love to read the opposite side.
I'll send you that information, and there's some data on both sides of the fence, the retention and not. But what I would say is, in both cases, if you have a retained student, if you're thinking about retaining a student, what that is truly saying is that there is an area of difficulty for that student. If you retain a student or you promote a student and nothing changes in terms of the support that they're providing, they're out either way. The intent is for both pieces. And I think that's where the biggest piece was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, and I would say that that's why too, when you look at it and you look at the legislation, it also is trying to look at every single way possible that prior to the student being retained, and then even if the student is retained, what are every single ways possible that we can look at it so that when the student is reading at grade level, that they can move forward prior to. And I apologize, I did something I never do. I apologize, it's 3:51. I never try to go overtime to keep people longer. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to stay, but for the rest of you, please have a good day. Thank you.